Good day. Today is Saturday, 15th February 2025, and today I am going to have to discuss what is starting to look like another chapter in the disintegration of the collective West. I say that because after the momentous events of the last couple of days, Pete Hegseth's astonishing speech at the Ramstein summit meeting, the meeting which was supposed to coordinate military assistance to Ukraine, chaired now, by the way, by the British Defence Secretary John Healey, and after the earth-shaking announcement that President Trump had a telephone call with President Putin, and after details of that call started to circulate, showing that the two leaders found on many issues a common language and even a certain degree of common ground. Though, again, let me stress that there has been no substantive agreement so far on the single most important issue, which is Ukraine. Well, after those two events, we've now had the third, perhaps the most extraordinary of all, which is J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference and the events which quickly followed. Now, the Munich Security Conference is, for me, one of the most interesting events that take place in Europe, and it has acquired a strange importance over the last 25 plus years. It was in 2007 that Vladimir Putin made his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference, in which, to the fierce opposition and hostility and the incredibly stony reception of the delegates, he condemned the whole doctrine of unipolarity, the hegemonic policies that were being followed by the United States and by the collective West, and suggested that an entirely different approach to international relations, one based upon there being more than one centre of power, made more sense and was more sustainable and stable for the long term. Again, it is useful today to go back and read Putin's speech. You can find it on his website, by the way. It's striking, given the context of today, how moderate and measured Putin's language was back in 2007. Though, of course, it sounded completely revolutionary at the time. And you can find, if you search hard enough, film of Putin speaking to the delegates at the Munich Security Conference. And you can see especially American officials, for example, Senator McCain, but also other Western officials, listening to him with looks on their faces of cold fury. So that was 2007. Then in 2015, immediately after the start of the Ukraine crisis, which had really got underway the previous year with the overthrow of the constitutionally and democratically elected president of Ukraine, President Yanukovych, in the events which the Russians, and by the way I call the Maidan coup, violent and unconstitutional transfer of power. Anyway, a year later, after there had been fighting in the area in Donbass, after there'd been the Minsk Agreement, the first Minsk Agreement, Minsk I, which was agreed in September 2014, and of course Minsk II, the main Minsk Agreement, agreed at the beginning of February 2015, the Minsk agreement, which of course was never honoured, which the Western powers and the Ukrainians almost immediately began to walk away from, even as they were voting for it at the UN Security Council. Anyway, I remember how at the Munich Security Conference in that year, 2015, Victoria Nuland, who was partly heading the US delegation, there were other US officials there as well, though I don't remember who they were. But I remember how at the Munich Security Conference in February 2015, Victoria Nuland not only made her complete displeasure and personal rejection of the Minsk agreement absolutely clear to everyone there, but she also made sure that members of the American delegation did not speak to German officials who had been involved in negotiating it. So that was perhaps a further indication that the Minsk agreement was not going to be honoured, given the importance that Victoria Nuland had in American policy at that time. And then, a couple of years further on, in February 2022, we had the most depressing, at least as far as I was concerned, and most astonishing Minsk Security Conference of all. Because this, of course, was held at a period of crisis. The Russians had proposed 2 draft treaties to try to stabilize the situation in Europe. The Americans went through the motions of negotiating with the Russians about the treaties, but it quickly became clear that the Americans were not interested in serious negotiations or serious discussions, and the Russians were becoming increasingly frustrated about all of that. There was already signs of a major deterioration in the security situation in Donbass, in the then line of contact, which of course is the line which has become now completely obsolete. The Russians since then have moved far beyond it, but anyway, there was tension along the line of contact. There was shelling, which the ODYSEE monitors at the time said was mainly Ukrainian, on the Donbass towns. And, well, I remember the atmosphere at the Munich Security Conference in February 2022. And I remember it with revulsion, reflecting the horror and dread with which I witnessed it at the time. Because in February 2022, Western officials, one after another, followed in an extraordinary sequence of incredible confrontational speeches about the Russians. They did so, as I remember, in a delirious and excited, even enthralled atmosphere. I remember Boris Johnson, Olaf Scholz, Annalena Baerbock, who'd just been to Moscow, by the way, just a short time before, and had had what, at the time, I thought was a productive meeting with the Russians. But of course, when she came back to Germany and when she attended the Munich Security Conference, one saw very quickly what she was really about. Emmanuel Macron as well, he too had been in lengthy discussions with the Russians, discussions the Russians found absolutely exasperating. He kept Putin up for hours, late into the night, coming up with all kinds of elaborate arguments and comments, but never apparently any concrete proposals to try to move forward the process of settlement in Ukraine. I remember Kamala Harris speaking. I remember all of them speaking, and they, each of them, one after the other, seemed to be, well, basically spoiling for a fight. There was, as I said, an atmosphere of dizzy anticipation. And it is important to say that though the Americans, Kamala Harris, I believe Tony Blinken was there as well, though I'm not absolutely sure about this. Anyway, though the Americans clearly were moving towards outright confrontation with the Russians, there was widespread talk of massive sanctions being prepared against the Russians, though at that time the extent of the sanctions was unclear, though it's obvious in retrospect that all of the European leaders had been fully briefed and had signed up to them. Anyway, even though the Americans were obviously being very confrontational and very aggressive, what astonished me and dismayed me was that the European leaders were so equally. All notions of détente, of Ostpolitik from the Germans, all of that was being thrown onto, well, the blaze as European leaders seemed excited and exhilarated at the thought of the coming confrontation with Russia. It was obvious to me at the time that they not only expected a war, but that they were looking forward to it. And when the Russians did begin the special military operation a few days later, which I have to say, after the speeches at the Munich Security Conference, including an astonishing one from Zelensky himself, in which he, for the first time, seemed to float the possibility of Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons eventually. Well, it began to seem to me at the time, at watching the Munich Security Conference, that was the first time I remember that I started to think that war was perhaps inevitable. Anyway, as became clear later, the planned sanctions that the Americans and the Europeans had agreed with each other were far more extensive than the very misleading information that had been published in the media in the weeks before. They went far beyond anything that anyone had anticipated. They involved freezes of Russian assets, including the state bank's assets. They involved banning of Russian airlines flying to Europe and ultimately the United States as well. They looked forward to restrictions on Russian oil and gas imports of Russian gas through the Nord Stream pipelines very quickly ended, and of course almost immediately Olaf Scholz supported the suspension of Nord Stream 2. Something, by the way, which caused us at the Duran to say that Europe had just chosen, and Germany had just chosen, a process of deindustrialization, which events are subsequently borne out. Anyway, all of these massive sanctions, including, by the way, the disconnection from SWIFT, all of them were coming, and it was clear that all the European leaders and the Americans knew all about this at the Munich Security Conference in February 2022 and were looking forward to it because they all were telling each other that Russia would not survive economically a sanctions attack on that kind of scale, and they all anticipated that there would be rapidly a major economic crisis in Russia. Some were suggesting that Russian GDP would halve, and there were expectations, obviously, that in the midst of that kind of crisis, there would be a political turmoil in Russia itself, that the oligarchs, unable any longer to travel to Europe, would turn on Putin, and that the regime in the Kremlin would fall. Anyway, that was February 2022. And, well, here we are now in February 2025, and the mood could not be more different. From euphoria, exhilaration, unity, determination to smash the Russians, to do away with that terrible man, Vladimir Putin, once and for all, with everybody anticipating that that would happen. Well, now we see a completely different atmosphere entirely. The Americans and the Russians are talking to each other under a new administration. The presidents of Russia and America, the president of Russia being, of course, still Vladimir Putin, are exchanging compliments. The Russian army continues its advances across Ukraine. The Americans are deeply unhappy about the war and are signaling clearly that they want out. I'm picking up rumours, by the way. Now, these are rumours that are coming through in the form of informal messages from, well, perhaps people who know, though I'm not sure that how well informed they actually are. But I'm picking up rumours from within the United States that Donald Trump wants to move as quickly as possible, provided he can get some progress in relations with the Russians, that he wants to move forward with a major relaxation of sanctions. Specifically, I suspect, this is my guess, I've not been told this, a relaxation of the energy sanctions so as to get oil and indeed energy prices falling again, global energy prices falling again. Well, all of that. And, well, the Europeans are furious about this, and the Europeans are now going to be even more furious about the latest shock speech, the horrifying speech, worse perhaps for them even than the Pete Hegseth speech or the fact of Trump's telephone call with Putin, the shocking speech by J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States. And, well, I have to say, listening to this speech, which I did listen to, and reading it, it confirms, it basically signals the end of the collective West. It is the US government telling the Europeans, look, all of these threats that you're talking about, the threats from Russia, the threats from China, they're really completely exaggerated. You have become an authoritarian, a collection of authoritarian states which restrict free speech, censor it wherever you can. You even got into the habit of banning elections when the result goes against the outcome that you want. And I think the collective horror of his European audience, Vance spoke about the actually outrageous cancellation and rescinding of the elections in Romania when it became clear that Mr. Georgescu was likely to win them. As he absolutely correctly said, this was an absolutely terrible thing, one that cannot be justified, and one which has barely been justified. By the way, a flimsy explanation provided of Russian manipulation of certain TikTok videos. No evidence has ever been provided for it. There's increasing skepticism that that even happened. But nonetheless, based on that skimpy evidence, the elections in Romania, the result of the first round of the elections was annulled, and the elections were cancelled and have to be held all over again, with hints that Mr. Georgescu in any rerun of the elections would not be allowed to stand. By the way, that is all disintegrating. The acting president of Romania, Mr. Iohannis, has been forced to step down. It looks as if the elections will finally take place in May, and it looks as if Mr. Georgescu will indeed be a candidate in those elections. And I think it would be a surprise now if he didn't win them, probably by a much bigger margin than he would have won them if they had taken place in the proper way. But I'm not going to discuss the elections in Romania now. Anyway, it was an astonishing speech from J.D. Vance. It was one which basically, as we say in England, read the riot act to the Europeans, told them that they have lapsed from basic democratic norms and values. He even did what I think must have offended them most. He compared them with the Soviet apparatchiki who used to run things in the Soviet Union, and said that the Europeans have increasingly started to behave in that kind of way. And the Europeans promptly fell into the trap which J.D. Vance perhaps was intentionally preparing for them. Because after they overcame their shock, they started to become increasingly critical and started to push back against the criticisms that J.D. Vance had made, except, in fact, and on the detail, they didn't. Just as in their various criticisms of Donald Trump's outreach to Putin and of Pete Hegseth's speech about Ukraine, the Europeans have come up with no constructive alternative to what Trump and Hegseth are doing. Everybody can see that the war in Ukraine is being lost. Nobody, however, apart from Trump, Hegseth, the Trump people, however, wants, as is absolutely clear now, to commence any kind of negotiation with the Russians at all. There's criticism that the Trump people are doing the wrong thing over Ukraine, but no one at all is coming up with any intelligible alternative. Nobody is suggesting what else should be done given the indisputable fact, I say indisputable, I mean I consider it to be indisputable, the undoubted fact that the war in Ukraine is lost and that the Russians are going to win, a point I have been making in programme after programme, and which is being made now by many others, Douglas McGregor, Daniel Davis, us, Alex Christoforou and me on the Duran, and, well, who knows, lots of others do. Anyway, no constructive proposals from the Europeans to rebut what Pete Hegseth has said and what Donald Trump has done. No constructive, viable, rational alternative strategy. And in response to J.D. Vance, no really substantive response to J.D. Vance's criticisms. The tone of the Europeans, especially the Germans, who have taken these criticisms particularly badly and who are furious because J.D. Vance has actually met members of the AfD. Anyway, the reaction of the Europeans is, how dare Vance talk about us in that way? It's outrageous that he should compare us with authoritarians. Why is he devoting a whole speech at the Munich Security Conference to our internal affairs rather than addressing the enormous threat to us from Russia, the security problems in Ukraine, as if these have not already been talked about at exhaustive length already? And as if J.D. Vance didn't already explain that by saying that the real threat is not from Russia and China, but from within Europe itself. And, well, the Germans apparently have taken very badly to the fact that Vance did meet with members of the AfD. This is outrageous. This is interference in Germany's internal affairs. It's meddling in German elections. You can find lots of comments to that effect from all sorts of people in Germany. Well, some of us might remember that when it comes to meddling in elections and interfering in other people's internal affairs, the Germans, the Europeans in general, are not in any way reluctant to do that. I remember the procession of European officials who turned up on Maidan Square in 2013, 2014 to support the protesters, to prepare the grounds for the coup. I remember, by the way, Victoria Nuland talking to the US ambassador, Jeffrey Pyatt, picking the future members of the Ukrainian government once President Yanukovych, who was at that time still in office, had been overthrown. No one in Europe complained about that. European delegates also, of course, went to Georgia, where they did much the same thing and supported the protesters there, whilst the election process in Georgia was underway. Well, now all of this is being done to them. The Americans are doing the same thing to them that the Europeans have done, alongside the Americans, of course, have done in many, many places. And, of course, the Europeans don't like it. They complain about meddling in their elections and meddling in their internal affairs. But it's a case of don't do unto me that which I do constantly to many others. Or at least that is how it looks to me. Now, coming back to my point that they're falling into a trap. I don't know whether, by the way, J.D. Vance actually intentionally laid this trap. But this splenetic reaction to J.D. Vance's speech, without, as I said, in substance, responding to any part of it, without dealing effectively to any of the criticisms that J.D. Vance made. Well, what it actually does is that it communicates back to the United States, to Donald Trump's electoral base, something very important, because, of course, what Vance was saying is that Europe is lapsing from its fundamental democratic values. It's giving up on them. It's giving up on free speech. It's giving up on the conduct of elections. It's engaging in all kinds of other authoritarian types of policies, or policies which Vance would say are authoritarian and which infringe what Vance and many people in the United States, people who have just voted for Donald Trump, would say go against common sense. And of course the Americans will come away and say to themselves, people in the United States will say, people who have voted for Donald Trump, members of his electoral base, they will say to themselves this: why should we continue to prioritize the defense of Europe? The Europeans not only cannot get their act together and defend themselves, they've been given repeated warnings by the United States that they must start to do so and not live off the American military, as they have been doing now, well, basically since NATO was established. Not only will the Europeans not take the proper steps to defend themselves, But why should the Americans defend them anyway? They're not real Democrats. They're not really convinced and believers in democracy. They don't practice free speech as they should. They're profoundly authoritarian. They interfere with the activities of American businesses. They set up firewalls and regulations and engage in censorship. The United States used to defend Europe from the Soviets because it was defending freedom and democracy, the free world, from Soviet totalitarianism. But actually, we look at today's Europe. This is what Americans are going to say. Many Americans, perhaps not all of them, but many Americans are going to say, well, it doesn't look that free and democratic after all. It's not really the free world any longer. So why should we devote energy and time and resources to defend it? Why should we not instead focus on ourselves, on our own borders, on our priorities in East Asia, where we face a challenge from China? Why should we not concentrate on these things, given that realistically the Europeans and us don't in the end share that much? Now, that's possibly the effect that J.D. Vance was trying to achieve. I don't know. I've never met Mr. Vance. He strikes me as an extremely clever man. And if it was the case that he did this intentionally with that kind of purpose in mind, it would not completely surprise me. But of course it may be that Vance was, generally speaking, out of sincere concern about what is happening in Europe, but the aggressively defensive reaction from the Europeans, quite plausibly, will achieve that effect which I have just said. Europe and America, which once together claimed to be the free world, a pompous and overblown self-description, I always thought, by the way, but anyway, that's another story. Anyway, Europe and America are starting to look at each other and notice the differences more than the resemblances. And the European reaction, particularly the reaction in Germany, will have made that sense sharper. I said at the start of the program that we're starting to look at the collapse of the collective West. Well, this speech, and even more perhaps the reaction to it, shows why. Anyway, the Europeans, Kaja Kallas, by the way, said that it looks as if the Americans are looking constantly now to pick fights with the Europeans. I am not convinced, actually, that that is true. But you can see why she might have thought that, and why perhaps some of the Europeans might be a little bit more careful and a little bit more measured and a little bit more humble in their response and self-critical in their response. Why it might be in their interests to be that going forward than they are now. Just saying. Anyway, Europe collectively horrified. Everything that has happened over this last week has shocked and horrified and appalled the leadership of Europe. Even though they have no coherent plans going forward, they have no real idea what to do. And as I said, it's difficult to see that the Americans are not going to draw their own conclusions and probably decide to press on with what they're doing. Now, let me once again revert to the topic of the conflict in Ukraine, because there continues to be, in my opinion, complete denialism about the realities. The Americans are in some ways still constrained about some of the things that they can say. They can't, I think, straightforwardly admit the truth that the Russians are going to win the war, even though that is obviously the case. The Americans cannot admit to something else, which is in some ways even more important and even more significant, which is that the Russians have outplayed the collective West. They have outproduced the collective West in production of armaments. They have done so without strain. And the result has been that the United States is facing, not just the United States, but NATO in general, is facing a catastrophic depletion of resources. Just to say, the United States has supplied Ukraine with at least 500 ATACMS missiles. We're told this by the New York Times, I think it was. 500 ATACMS missiles. I believe that is around a quarter of the stockpile. It might be more than that. There is no replacement for the ATACMS missile in immediate sight. And of course, production of the ATACMS has ended. The United States and the other NATO powers have disastrously depleted the amount of surface-to-air missiles that they have provided, that they possess, by trying to bolster Ukraine's stockpile of surface-to-air missiles. The United States makes only a limited number of Patriot air defense interceptors. It has to meet demands from Israel and some of its Gulf allies. It needs Patriot missile interceptors in the Asia-Pacific region. It has had to send disproportionate numbers of air defense missiles, of Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine. And almost certainly by now, it is running short of these vital weapons for itself. I have discussed in programme after programme the vexed problem of artillery shells. Production of artillery shells has been rising in the United States, less so in Europe, despite claims to the contrary. The Russians are massively outproducing the United States and the collective West in production of artillery shells. They are probably able to draw on North Korean production as well. The point is, and this is a further point to understand, even as the Americans increase production of artillery shells, given the insatiable demand from the Ukrainians for artillery shells, American stockpiles of artillery shells either continue to be depleted or are not being restocked because all new production has been shipped to Ukraine. The same goes for self-propelled howitzers. The United States still has quite a few. Most of the European countries no longer do. They have been sending self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine in appallingly huge numbers, where most of them have already been destroyed. The United States has apparently run through much of its stockpile of M777 howitzers, and it is now clear that the United States has sent huge numbers of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, far more than the 200 that they sent back in 2023, and hundreds upon hundreds of Stryker wheeled armoured personnel carriers to Ukraine, and this also has now dented heavily US stockpiles. We haven't yet had a full accounting of the amount of equipment that the United States and the collective West has sent to Ukraine. I suspect that Pete Hegseth's priority is to try to get on top of this question. But the point is simply this. The United States has already run down its armed forces, the equipment for its armed forces, to dangerous levels. It cannot go on doing this indefinitely. The Russians, by contrast, are ramping up production. They're increasing their stockpiles, even as they use weapons in increasing numbers on the battlefronts, and their armies are getting bigger and bigger. Given that this is so, prolonging the war further, a war that is already lost, is merely going to turn what is already a critical situation into a catastrophic one at a time when the United States says that it wants to refocus resources on the Asia Pacific. And though maybe if you're talking about funding overall, the costs perhaps are not excessive, I still suspect that even if we're not talking about weapons that would necessarily be needed for the Asia Pacific that have been sent to Ukraine, though some of them are, the fact that the United States is having to devote tax dollars and production lines to making weapons for the war in Ukraine means that those tax dollars and those production lines are not being used to build weapons and equipment suitable for a conflict in the Asia Pacific region. That is the reality. In his speech, Pete Hegseth spoke about hard power realities. To my mind, that is the single most important hard power reality of all. This conflict in Ukraine has been a catastrophic drain on American and NATO resources. And given that the United States is a global superpower with interests in many places, first and foremost in the Asia Pacific, it has to staunch it. If it cannot achieve victory, it must find a negotiated settlement to stop this drain of resources. And if it cannot find a negotiated settlement, it has no option ultimately other than to walk away. That is the reality. It is a reality that commentators, Western officials, American officials obviously cannot say, even though it is probably the single thing that is driving the decision making more than any other. Anyway, there we go. That's a point I wanted to make. It's a point that's been made before many times. As I said, it's not being discussed. If all of the plans, the military plans, the sanctions plans had been a success, then we would not be where we are. And I'm sure that even Donald Trump would not be calling Vladimir Putin and discussing peace. It's because we find ourselves in this point of failure that the Americans have decided to go in this direction. Now, just to get a sense of the complete bankruptcy of Western policy, just go to an extraordinary article that two British ministers, John Healey and David Lammy, the defence minister and the foreign minister, have written, which has just appeared in the Daily Telegraph. They insist that a bad peace in Ukraine would cause damage, as they put it, far beyond Ukraine. And they say that we must give Zelensky strongest possible hand in talks and turn up pressure on Putin ahead of the war's third anniversary. They make, by the way, a very interesting point in the article, a very revealing one. This is what they say, for example, about the Minsk agreements. They say that, like us, the US recognizes the failure of Minsk agreements, deals made from a position of division and weakness. So here, the British are coming forward and admitting that they were opposed to the Minsk agreement all along. It's not a direct admission, but how else to read that sentence? Deals made from a position of division and weakness. But then what do they actually propose? What do they actually propose that is going to put the position of the West, make it stronger than it would otherwise have been? Well, they say that all we need to turn up, we all need to turn up the pressure on Russia. Putin's economy is struggling. The Kremlin spent more on military aid than social welfare since the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Maybe that is true, maybe not. The fact is that living standards in Russia are rising and the economy is growing. And then they go on to say sanctions on Russia are a particular priority. The United Kingdom has sanctioned more than 100 ships, as well as Gazprom Neft and PJSC Surgutneftgaz, two of Russia's big four oil companies. So there have to be more sanctions. Apparently, there needs to be an increase in sanctions pressure. And basically, that's all. That's all that they can come up with. Sanctions on the Russian energy sector, which is going to increase the price of energy and increase inflation even further, creating more hardship for people throughout the world, including in the collective West. And they know it. They say that Putin's 2022 invasion took 1.5% of global GDP and added 3% to European inflation. Well, I don't know about whether it took 1.5% of global GDP. I actually suspect it was more than that, just saying. But it added 3% to European inflation. So what they propose to do is to add even more to that inflation than the 3% that has already been added. This is bankruptcy. It is nihilism. It is, again, doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result, even as you lose. Anyway, let's go back to J.D. Vance, because, of course, he didn't just make a speech. He did other things. He also met with Zelensky. And Zelensky, by the way, gives me every impression of being a man absolutely at the end of his tether. He is now in a process of disintegration. Because, to be very clear, given the depletion of resources, given that the Americans are now talking to the Russians, I think that we've now reached that stage when it is now a certainty that after the 90 days are up, American economic aid to Ukraine will continue to be stopped. And I think that before very long, one way or the other, military aid for Ukraine is going to stop as well. How do the Americans justify giving more military aid to Ukraine, given all that they have been saying? There is not going to be another appropriation by Congress. There is no conceivable way, it seems to me, that the administration, after all that it has said about the loss of money and the bad investments and all of that, are going to come along to Congress and say that they need still more money, so even more money can be embezzled even further. They're not going to say any of those things. So then, and they're not going to do any of those things. So Zelensky knows that as soon as the funds and equipment, military equipment, allocated for Ukraine by the Biden administration have run out, that the support from the United States is going to end. By the way, given that the American and Russian presidents are now meeting and talking, and that the Americans are negotiating with the Russians, I think it is now extremely unlikely that the Americans are going to support any ideas of confiscating the Russian assets. I say that, of course, everything may change, but for the moment at least, that would diverge completely from the line that the Americans are taking at the moment, which appears to be to seek a rapprochement. And beyond that, just to say, going back to J.D. Vance, he is now strongly pushed back against the way in which the Wall Street Journal described his interview. What I discussed yesterday, the spin that was put on that interview, which some people thought implied that Vance was looking at further sanctions, was threatening the Russians with further sanctions and potentially American military deployments. When I read the Wall Street Journal article, as I said in my program yesterday, it didn't really seem to me as if that was actually what J.D. Vance was saying. And he's now come back and he said that his words have been twisted. The fact that the Wall Street Journal twisted my words in the way they did for this story is absurd, but not surprising, considering they have spent years pushing for more American sons and daughters in uniform to be unnecessarily deployed overseas. President Trump is the ultimate deal maker and will bring peace to the region by ending the war in Ukraine, as we've always said. American troops should never be put into harm's way where it doesn't advance American interests and security. This war is between Russia and Ukraine. In other words, it is not between Russia and the United States, and the United States is not going to become involved. So, Zelensky knows all of this. He's heard that the Americans are saying no to NATO for Ukraine. He's now bitterly complaining that the Americans are have never, in fact, committed to Ukraine joining NATO. He's basically saying that the Ukrainians were led up the primrose path, that they were deceived. He's absolutely right, by the way, about that. He should have listened to Professor Mearsheimer, who warned the Ukrainians about this all the way back 10 years ago. Just saying. But anyway, he's now complaining about this. He's furious, obviously, that he's been told this already by the Americans. He's still insisting on security guarantees, and he's making it clear that the security guarantees must come from the Americans, because European security guarantees are worthless. And he says that he needs huge amounts of weapons and an army of 1.5 million men in Ukraine, a Ukrainian army of 1.5 million men armed to the teeth by the Americans and the Europeans in order to be able to confront the Russians. 1.5 million men from a country with a population of perhaps 29 million, if we're being generous. A country where, by universal acknowledgement, the birth rate is at disastrous levels, a demographic catastrophe is playing out, and the number of young people is very small. I mean, this is a grotesque fantasy. And as I said, it goes to show how the extent to which Zelensky is disintegrating. But anyway, he went into his meeting with J.D. Vance, and apparently he was still hoping to get security guarantees or a pledge for security guarantees from the Americans. I said yesterday in my previous program that anybody who'd listened to Pete Hegseth closely would see that the Americans are not in the business any longer of giving Ukraine security guarantees. Pete Hegseth makes it pretty clear, if you listen to him carefully and if you read his words carefully, that the only security guarantees that Ukraine can receive will be from the Europeans, not from the United States, and the Europeans will not receive security guarantees for any troops they deploy in Ukraine from the Americans. Those troops, those European troops, would not be covered by Article 5 or implicitly any equivalent. Anyway, Zelensky went into that meeting with Vance, apparently hoping to trade promises of access to Ukraine's mineral wealth in return for security guarantees. And of course, the Americans told him, as they were bound to do, that they want the mineral wealth, but they're not prepared to give the security guarantees. So Zelensky walked away from that meeting completely empty-handed. Of course, some will say that so did the Americans, but I don't think the Americans have any real belief or expectation that they will ever obtain Ukraine's mineral wealth. They might eventually do a deal, but if so, it'll have to be either with the Russians, assuming the Russians end up in control of that mineral wealth as part of a general settlement and a lifting of sanctions, or with any Ukrainian leader who makes peace and becomes Zelensky's successor, just saying. But the Americans were never going to give Zelensky security guarantees. And this mirage of buying those security guarantees with promises of access to America's mineral wealth, something that Zelensky has been plugging ever since he met Donald Trump in Trump Tower back in September. Anyway, that mirage yesterday collided with reality, and it shattered. Zelensky must have found that it shattered all around him. The Americans have no expectation of getting Ukraine's mineral wealth anytime soon. And as Hegseth has said, as Trump has hinted, as reports in the American media have confirmed, this administration is not in the business of giving Ukraine security guarantees. So Zelensky came out of that meeting, and he came out of it empty-handed. Well, Vance, again, made it clear that there need to be negotiations, there needs to be peace. He then handed over to Zelensky, and Zelensky basically had nothing to say of any significance over the course of the subsequent press conference. Zelensky continues to say, by the way, that he's not prepared to negotiate with the Russians. He will only negotiate with one specific Russian. He will only meet, apparently, with Vladimir Putin. He won't meet with Lavrov or Shoigu or Belousov or Ryabkov or anyone else in Russia to negotiate the future of Ukraine. He will only meet with Putin. Of course, he signed a decree on the 2nd of October 2022 in which he prohibits himself and anyone else in Ukraine from negotiating with the Russians so long as Putin remains president of Russia. But now, of course, Zelensky is saying that despite that decree, which he changes what it says, or perhaps he's going to forget about it, or whatever. Anyway, Zelensky now says that he will negotiate, but only with Putin and with no one else. Well, of course, he did negotiate with Putin in February, March, April 2022. He had a deal on the table. His negotiators initialed it, and he walked away. The Americans and the British wanted him to walk away. They told him, as he's just admitted in an interview he's given to The Guardian, that they were not prepared to provide Ukraine with security guarantees if he signed that agreement. And of course, what he now finds is that he's not going to get security guarantees from the Americans. The people he acknowledges are the only people who are in a position to give real security guarantees to Ukraine. The Europeans can't. He's now found that there are no circumstances in which Ukraine is going to get any security guarantees at all. It's not been understood or widely reported, but the rug was comprehensively pulled from under Zelensky's feet over the course of that meeting with Vance. Just saying. And of course, we've also now heard the Europeans, commentaries in Europe, coming forward and telling us about the kind of force that Europe might be able to rustle up and send to Ukraine, either as a peacekeeping force or a war-fighting force. There's been various claims and commentaries and discussions and reports and suggestions that up to 200,000 men might be sent to Ukraine, or 40,000, or 100,000, or 150,000. I've pointed out in many places that a peacekeeping contingent of that size is not a peacekeeping contingent, it is a war-fighting contingent. Well, yesterday we got what I suspect is the more realistic number, 25,000. That is all that the European members of NATO can scratch together. 25,000. Now, bear in mind that The Russian forces camped outside Pokrovsk probably exceed that number significantly. According to the Ukrainians, General Teplinsky's forces in Kherson and southern Zaporozhye region barely committed to the battle up to now, number 140,000. The Ukrainian military is said to number, well, there are varying estimates, but people say that the frontline forces perhaps number around 250 to 350,000. 25,000 men from Britain, France, Germany, already depleted because so much of the equipment has been sent to Ukraine. What, realistically, can they hope to do? The Europeans, you can see this all over the various commentaries in the European media, including the British media, are wringing their hands and saying they've been asked to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. They've asked to commit forces to defend Ukraine, and they are not able to do any of these things because without the Americans, the resources to do them are simply not there. So there we go. We are looking, and I think this is the point to say, we are looking at the crumbling, the disintegration of that impressive, monumental edifice, the collective West, compared to that show of strength and unity we saw at the Munich Security Conference in February 2022. On the eve of the war, it is a sad and dismal, and at times I have to say, even a funny spectacle. Now, there are still, of course, some people who live in their own world. I talked about how the British, John Healey and David Lammy are still talking about more sanctions against the Russians and putting Ukraine in a stronger position in negotiations without actually explaining how that is going to be done. By the way, they make incredibly rude comments about Russia just after Trump has had a discussion with Putin talking about Russia and America as great nations. We read that for 20 years, Vladimir Putin has been repeating the mistakes of Russia's past by seeking to recreate the Russian Empire and suffocate the countries around its borders. That is the only thing that David Lammy and John Healey have to say about Russia. There's no acknowledgement anywhere in this article, for example, about Russia's contributions to European civilization, European history, the extraordinary role it played as an ally of Britain during the Second World War. Nothing like that. Just a repetition of the cliches about how Russia in its past was an imperialist power and supposedly still is today. Just saying. But the British continue to think that they can somehow work the Americans. Starmer, of course, phones up Zelensky and assures him after Trump and Putin spoke and after Hegseth said that Ukraine cannot join NATO. Starmer comes along and says that Ukraine remains on an irreversible course towards NATO. By the way, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, has spoken in the same way. Well, the Americans, or Donald Trump specifically, have responded to all of this in a completely characteristic way. There have been trade discussions between the Americans and the British. The British have high hopes of those trade discussions. Just saying. In the midst of them, apparently, Donald Trump telephoned Starmer and said all sorts of nice things. The British are very happy about this. You can see this in their media today. It astonishes me that after all that we've seen over the last 3 weeks, after the episode with Kellogg, which I discussed 2 days ago in one of my videos, that the British can't see that they're being played, that the Americans have their own objectives and are moving forward purposefully with them, and that in the meantime, Donald Trump is perhaps enjoying himself by playing with Starmer that old game of cat and mouse. Anyway, there we are. Now, let's just I just want to say a few more things before I get to a quick discussion of the military situation. The blogger who is known as the blogger who is known as Institutional War Theory has written another extraordinarily insightful piece about the conflict and about the Trump administration's diplomatic moves. I'm not going to read through it because it's not so different from my own analysis. But if you want to find a place where it's all written down, I don't think you can go to a better place than that. So I would, as I said, refer to that article. I think it's a good article. And as I said, I think that it would be worth reading. And as I said, it sets everything up very clearly there. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second is that in Russia, this is all about the Russian economy. I know it's a subject that causes some people's eyes to glaze over, but as I said, there continue to be deluded hopes among some people in the West that the Russian economy's overheating is going to trigger its eventual collapse. In Russia, the central bank has decided to keep interest rates at the current level of 21%, and there's been a long statement from the central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, and she has just said that inflation in Russia is abating. It's not yet affecting the headline figures because of the inflationary momentum that had built up in the second half of 2024, but inflation is abating. She expects that on a monthly basis, it will have fallen by the end of this year to an annualized rate of around 4%, though because of the earlier high inflation that there's been in the first few weeks of this year, the overall headline rate of inflation in Russia this year is going to be around 7%. She also said that she expects inflation to peak in around April, May, and to start to decline significantly thereafter. So that is Nabiullina. I think by the end of this year, we're going to have to see a completely new narrative being fabricated to explain the resilience of the Russian economy. The overheating will clearly be starting to abate. I wonder what exactly people will say, but hell will freeze over before some people admit the reality that the Russian economy's size, sophistication, and diversity has been massively underestimated in the West. Anyway, let's now turn to the military situation, because their events are moving extremely fast, and we are again starting to see an acceleration. I suspect that this is connected, by the way, with a change in weather conditions. It's become much colder. Temperatures have fallen below zero. That has caused the ground to harden, which means that the Russians are able to start moving, and they're moving much, much faster. Now, in Kursk region, it looks as if the Russians have either entirely captured Selidovo or are about to do so. This, Sverdlikova, sorry, the village of Sverdlikova, not Selidovo. This is the village near the main transportation artery that the Ukrainians rely upon to transport their forces and their supplies from Sumy in Ukraine to Suja. The Russians, as I discussed yesterday, are surprised by Ukraine's inability to defend Sverdlikovo and the speed with which the Russians have been able to capture this village. My own guess is that we're going to see a major crisis in the Kursk area start to play out over the next couple of weeks. The Russians have significantly expanded their bridgehead in the west of the Oskol River. Our old friend Andrei Marochko has today, or rather yesterday, told TASS that the Russians keep exploiting their success near the settlement of Dvorechnoye. This is the big settlement west of the Oskol River that the Russians have captured. After two concerted strikes in the area, the Russian troops have managed to break through the Ukrainian second defense line and have advanced by nearly 1 kilometer. This factor has enabled them to envelop the Ukrainian battle group stationed between Dvorechnoye and Zapadnoye in a pincer movement. So anyway, that's what Marochko says. He says that all the strategic heights in the area are now under Russian control. So it looks like, at least according to Marochko, it looks like the Ukrainian defense lines west of the Oskol River are collapsing, and that the Ukrainians are about to suffer a significant defeat there. Perhaps their major forces will be either severely weakened and destroyed, which will, of course, make it easier for the Russians to advance towards Kupiansk and subsequently Izium and Balakleya north of Slavyansk. And, well, since we're talking about Slavyansk, there are reports this morning that another village on the Zherebets River, Yampolovka, has come completely under Russian control, and there are further reports that the Russians are going to start pushing south, firstly towards another village, Torske, which they briefly occupied a few weeks ago. At least they sent troops there, but they seem to have pulled back from Torske. This is another village south of it's a village south of Yampolovka, again on the Yerebets River. And beyond that the Russians could also soon, once they've captured Torske, continue to push south and capture another important village, or recapture another important village. The Russians held it for a time in 2022, called Yampol. Now, all of this is important because it puts the Russians in a strong position to recapture the small town of Liman, which lies immediately to the west of Slavyansk. The Russians briefly held Liman in 2022. if they, of course, are able to capture Liman and break through and capture Kupiansk and Izium and Balakleya further north, then a semicircle around Slavyansk, which the Russians briefly had in 2022, will have been recreated. But beyond that, if the Russians also capture Yampol, they will be very close to encircling the Ukrainian forces that continue to defend Seversk. Now, this is a different situation from the one that existed in 2022, because the Russians now control places to the south of Seversk, like Rozdolovka. They have apparently captured the eastern part of the village of Verkhokamyanska, which is immediately to the west of, to the east of Seversk. They, of course, control Bakhmut and Solidar, which lie to the south of Seversk and which were main supply bases for the defense of Seversk. And if the Russians capture Yampol, they would be in a position to cut the main supply road to Seversk from Slavyansk itself. Just saying. So, put all of this together, and of course if Liman falls, the problems for Seversk get even greater, because Liman is also very close to the main supply lines. But unlike in 2022, all the supply lines to Seversk, to the Ukrainian garrison there, will have been cut off. In 2022, for a time, because the Russians controlled Yampol and Liman, the Ukrainians weren't able to send supplies to Seversk from Slavyansk, but they could send supplies to Ukraine, to Seversk from the south, from Bakhmut. But Bakhmut is now under Russian control. Solidar is under Russian control. If the Russians retake Liman and Yampol, then all of the supply lines to Seversk will have been cut. And at that point, the garrison there is going to be in an absolutely critical position. It would be very, very difficult, or so it seems to me, for the Ukrainians to be able to hold on to Seversk for any further time. So things are playing out rapidly in that area of the battlefront. Elsewhere, events are moving faster still. A couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, the Russians captured the village of Vozvyzhenka, which lies to the south of the main road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. The Russians have since captured certain villages around Vozvyzhenka. They've captured Yelizavetivka to the west of Vozvyzhenka. They've captured Vodyanye Druha, which is immediately to the north of Vozvyzhenka. They've also captured apparently another village called Tarasivka, which is slightly to the north of Vodyanye Druha as well. And apparently they've cut the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka in several places. But there are reports now that the Russians are also advancing towards the village of Malinivka, which actually lies directly on the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. If this village is captured, then the Russians will be securely positioned north of the road. They could start to capture places like Novoekonomichny, and that would put them in a position where they could start to cut the roads to Pokrovsk from the north, the remaining supply roads leading to Pokrovsk from the north Ukrainian counterattacks southwest of Pokrovsk in Pishanye and Kotlino have been apparently defeated. The Ukrainians did recapture a tiny village called Zvirove, just north of Pishanye, but the expectations are that the Russians will recapture it. There are some acerbic comments, apparently, on both the Russian and Ukrainian parts of the internet, which I've not seen, about the incompetence of the Ukrainian commander, General Tarnavsky, who has again failed in organizing these Ukrainian counterattacks. Just saying. But anyway, the Russians, because they still control Kotlino, in fact, they have consolidated their control of Kotlino and are expanding their control of Udachnye, can cut the roads leading into Pokrovsk from the west, and if they capture Malinivka at Novoekonomichnye, they would be in a position to cut the roads leading into Pokrovsk from the north. Pokrovsk, in other words, is within sight of being encircled. Not encircled completely. The Ukrainian troops defending Pokrovsk could still retreat across the fields and using country roads and doing those kind of things. But the main supply roads into Pokrovsk will have been cut, and it's difficult to see how the defense of Pokrovsk could be sustained much longer. Now, the Russian advances north of Vozvyzhenka also open up possibilities for further Russian advances from the west towards Konstantinovka. The Russians look like they are preparing to attack Konstantinovka. This is this city south of Slavyansk-Kramatorsk from multiple directions. They now control Toretsk. Marochko says that the Ukrainians now only control 20% of Chasiv Yar. It's not quite the same as saying that the Russians control 80% of Chasiv Yar. Some parts of Chasiv Yar, which the Ukrainians don't control, might still not have been fully captured by the Russians. But we can see from this report, which is almost certainly correct, that the battle for Chasiv Yar is also coming to an end. So a Ukrainian crisis in the north with Liman, Kupiansk, Izium, Balakleya likely to be overrun eventually over the course of the next couple of months. A crisis for the Ukrainians to the west of Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, with Siversk likely to be surrounded and to fall, and a crisis for the Ukrainians around Pokrovsk, which looks likely to be surrounded as well before long. And more reports that the Andreevka fortified area is starting to disintegrate, with the Russians now apparently in full control of Andreevka, and more reports of a major Russian offensive now taking place westwards from Velikaya Novosilka, ultimately towards the Dnieper. Now, this is, as I said, still preliminary steps made by the Russians. The big advance, probably still to come, probably will happen in the spring. It is all but inconceivable that we're going to get a ceasefire anytime soon. And, well, the facts all point in the same direction. I've said it already. The United States has exhausted its ability to keep Ukraine supplied. It's almost certainly going to cut off assistance. Before long, we can see that the Europeans as they understand, are not able to fill the gap. The Ukrainians cannot understand this very well. And the Russians are preparing the ground for more advances. Not surprising that Zelensky is showing all the signs of falling apart. An interesting week. Zelensky falling apart, well, no surprise there. Ukraine perhaps likely to do so as well before long. The collective West perhaps showing the first signs of coming apart as well. Altogether, an extraordinary week playing out in Munich 3 years after the leaders of the collective West came together and planned the overthrow of Putin and ultimately of Russia. Well, there we are. This is where I end today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.